Julius Caesar was not a boy wonder. Augustus is consul when he's 19. Pompey was commanding armies when he was 22. Not so with Caesar. In this video, we are going to look at an early speech that he made that really made his career take off, and some lessons we can learn from it. This speech was made in front of a tough audience, and it actually didn't go that well. But Caesar did some very smart things that made it go well for him. I'm Alex Petkus, PhD, and my mission with the Cost of Glory channel is to bring you lessons that you can use from history's greatest orators, statesmen, and conquerors, the men of ancient Greece and Rome. If you like that idea, subscribe. So we're going to give you the full speech in a couple of minutes, but watch this introduction first because it explains the background and you need to know a little bit of the lead up or you're not going to get much out of it. So famously, Caesar is a quaestor in Spain and he's visiting a temple of Hercules with his friends one day. And he sees a statue in there, for some reason, of Alexander the Great. And his friends are like, wait, we've been here for a little while, Caesar, let's get out of here, it's time to leave. And then they notice Caesar is weeping. And they say, Caesar, are you crying? What's wrong? And he says, don't you think it is a matter for weeping that when Alexander was my age, he was already the king of so many nations, and yet I have done nothing worthy of such eminence. So already at that age, Caesar has a vision of who he wants to become and what he wants to do with his life and what he wants to achieve, and he hasn't gotten there yet. But he gets his chance when he's about 37 years old. He's just been elected praetor, the second highest office in the state, and it's the Catilinarian conspiracy, a great crisis for the state at Rome. So here's the big picture. Cicero, the consul, has just had a number of prominent men arrested throughout the city. He's accused them of being conspirators with this ringleader, Catiline, who has recently left the city and raised an army a few days' march away. He's in a secluded valley and kind of confused reports are coming in, but it seems like they may have a civil war on their hands with Catiline raising this army. And these guys that Cicero's just arrested have just been presented with incontrovertible evidence in the Senate House. They've confessed to their crimes. They are guilty, manifestly guilty. Everybody agrees. They agreed themselves. And so now they're trying to decide what to do. Now, the Senate is not a judicial body. It's not a court, but they have the power by the Constitution to vote and enable the consuls to do whatever it takes to save the state. In other words, they can declare a state of emergency, and if they so will, they can instruct the consul in that state of emergency to arrest such conspirators without trial. This is very serious. These are Roman citizens. You can't just do this, but a trial would take a lot of time. So, they're having this debate. Should we execute the Catilinarian conspirators that have just confessed? So that's the context. Everybody has seen these men admit that they are guilty. They were going to set fire to the Senate, set fire to the city. They're going to murder a bunch of prominent men, including Cicero. And then they were going to open the gates to Catiline and his horde and start a bloody revolution. And the senators are all clamoring, death, death, death. The mood of the room is pretty strongly for execute these men. Instruct the consul to do so. But who stands up? Julius Caesar. Caesar, again, a young, up-and-coming politician. He's been elected praetor, which is not nothing, but he hasn't really achieved anything in his career that would make him not weep at a statue of Alexander the Great. But he begins to speak, and let's take a brief preview at a couple of things that he does. Again, we're going to read the whole speech in its entirety shortly, but here's a few pre-lessons. First of all, one thing that's very interesting about this speech is that Caesar knows he has the burden of proof on him. He's about to make an argument that he knows his audience is not in the mood to hear. That is essentially, he's going to argue for a form of clemency. He's not going to call it that. Mercy, in other words. These senators are foaming at the mouth. They want these guys to die, and Caesar is going to propose an alternative solution. So he knows that the senators are not going to be well disposed to listen to his point. So the way that he begins is very important. Now see if you can catch what he does here. This is the beginning. Members of the Senate, all men who deliberate upon difficult questions had best be devoid of hatred, friendship, anger, and pity. When those feelings stand in the way, the mind cannot at all easily discern the truth, and no one has ever served at the same time his passions and his best interests. So he begins with what Chris Voss would call tactical empathy. He names the emotions that he knows his audience is feeling. And this is important because strong emotions can really lock up your mind and make you unable to hear other alternatives. And by naming these emotions, he sort of clears them out of the way. He softens them up a little bit to make people more conscious of what they're feeling and say, yes, I know you're feeling this, but this is not necessarily the basis of the best decisions that ever get made by humans. The next thing he does that is really important is he frames the audience in a certain way. He gives them a positive portrayal of the best version of their self that corresponds with the goals that he's trying to achieve with the speech. Namely, he says, you are reasonable men, and it behooves reasonable men to make a choice based not on emotion, we're all angry at these guys, but on reason, on the best consideration of our interests. Reasonable men think before acting, they act upon good counsel. And so he's suggesting if they take his advice, they're going to prove that they are still reasonable men who act on good counsel. So that kind of clears the way for his argument. This is a very important thing to do if you are ever finding yourself in that position of arguing something unpopular to a tough crowd. Name the emotions that the audience is feeling that you're going to be fighting against, and then frame them as the best version of themselves that they're going to prove that they are if they take your advice, or at least if they listen to you and hear you out. So now that he's got their minds open a bit, he doesn't go straight into his argument. He begins by telling a story, which is very smart, softens them up even more. And he tells a few stories. There's a story about what happened with King Perseus of Macedonia. There's a story when they were conquering Greece. There's a story about the war with the Carthaginians, the Punic Wars. And he also takes the time to interpret those stories. So don't forget to do that. That's a bonus. 3B, interpret the story you give, and we'll see how he does that. But I want to get to some stories that he tells as part of his argument from precedents that you have to understand the background of to get the weight of. Now, Caesar's proposal is basically to not execute these guys, rather to kind of hold them in a permanent state of imprisonment, to distribute them throughout Italy and secure holding places and kind of keep them in life in prison, which is weird because the Romans don't really do lifetime incarceration. You usually either get exiled or you get executed. And he's going to argue that this is a fate worse than death. But his reasons for doing this are very interesting. And he brings up this important example of precedent of the 30 tyrants at Athens. This is the regime that took over Athens, the 30 oligarchs, after the Spartans conquered the city as a Spartan-installed government around 404, 403 AD. And what the 30 tyrants did at Athens was essentially they started by prosecuting and rounding up and executing people that everybody hated, these demagogues who had driven Athens to war and were bad guys, and everybody agreed, without trial or without due process. And at first, everybody thought this was a good idea. Hey, we hate these guys. They're corrupt. The 30 tyrants are bringing justice. But very quickly, once they had set that precedent of executing citizens without proper due process, they started just killing people that they felt like killing because they were rich or they had insulted them in the past. And they sort of took the law into their own hands, and law and order broke down. It ended up being a bloodbath, and bad memories about this. You know, Socrates tells about this in the Apology of Plato. And so Caesar's argument is basically it's a slippery slope from executing a couple of citizens without trial, even though they're manifestly guilty and everybody hates them, to a tyranny, a kangaroo court, lawless state. Slippery slope argument. And he brings up another very important example, which is the reign of Sulla. And this was in living memory for everybody in the room. Sulla's reign of terror, you might call it, his proscriptions after he won the Civil War. Sulla was an aristocratic politician who won this bloody civil war. And once he got in power around 82 BC, he made a list of all of his enemies, hundreds of senators, maybe 1,000, maybe more equestrians, the richest men in Rome who had opposed him in the Civil War. He made a list, and basically there was a bounty on their heads, and Most of them got executed, some of them fled into exile, but all of their properties were confiscated. And once again, Caesar says this is a pattern. Sulla started with people that were manifestly guilty, who had been responsible for prolonging the civil war, and many of them had put citizens to death without trial themselves, so they were hated, and it was felt that this was just. But things led to things, and Sulla, or Sulla's friends, who were profiteering off of this, just started adding names to the list because they wanted to raise cash or buy somebody's mansion at pennies on the dollar. And it ended up being horrific and scarring a whole generation of Romans. All right, so that's the background of the speech. The narrator, by the way, the source that we have for this speech is Sallust in his War with Catiline, a short historical treatise that he did on the events of 64, 63 BC, the Catilinarian conspiracy. And there's good reason to suppose that this is more or less what Caesar said on that day. Sallust was a man who knew Caesar personally. He was later an officer in Caesar's army. There were stenographers operating at that time. Cicero had a stenographer. So this could be almost verbatim what Caesar said on that day. At the very least, it's close. And there were enough men still alive when Sallust was writing who remembered it that, it's a pretty good guess that this is what Caesar said that made the speech that made his career take off. So here's the speech, but be sure to stay to the very end where we're going to discuss how to set yourself up to succeed even if you fail. Here he begins. Fathers of the Senate, all men who deliberate upon difficult questions ought to be free from hatred and friendship, anger and pity. When these feelings stand in the way, the mind cannot easily discern the truth, and no mortal man has ever served at the same time his passions and his best interests. When you apply your intellect, it prevails. If passion possesses you, it holds sway, and the mind is impotent. I might mention many occasions, fathers of the Senate, when kings and peoples, under the influence of wrath or pity, have made errors of judgment. But I prefer to remind you of times when our forefathers, resisting the dictates of passion, have acted justly and in order. In the Macedonian War which we waged with King Perseus, the great and glorious community of the Rhodians, which owed its growth to the support of the Roman people, was unfaithful to us and hostile. But after the war was over and the question of the Rhodians was under discussion, our ancestors let them go unpunished, for fear that some might say that the wealth of the Rhodians, rather than resentment for the wrong they had done, had led to the declaration of war. So too in all the Punic Wars, although the Carthaginians both in time of peace and in the course of truces had often done many abominable deeds, the Romans never retaliated when they had the opportunity, but they inquired rather what conduct would be consistent with their dignity than how far the law would allow them to go in taking vengeance on their enemies. You likewise, fathers of the Senate, must beware of letting the guilt of Publius Lentulus and the rest of the conspirators have more weight with you than your own dignity, and of taking more thought for your anger than for your good name. If a punishment commensurate with their crimes can be found, I favor a departure from precedent. But if the enormity of their guilt surpasses all men's imagination, I should advise limiting ourselves to such penalties as the law has established. The greater number of those who have expressed their opinions before me have deplored the lot of the Commonwealth in finished and noble phrases. They have dwelt upon the horrors of war, the wretched fate of the conquered, the ravaging of maidens and boys, children torn from their parents' arms, matrons subjected to the will of the victors, temples and homes pillaged, bloodshed and fire. In short, arms and corpses everywhere, gore and grief. But, by the immortal gods, what was the purpose of such speeches? Was it to make you detest the conspiracy? Do you think that a man who has not been disturbed by a crime so monstrous and so cruel will be fired by a speech? Certainly not. No mortal man thinks his own wrongs unimportant. Many indeed are accustomed to resent them more than is right. But not all men, fathers of the Senate, are allowed the same freedom of action. If the humble, who pass their lives in obscurity, commit any offense through anger, it is known to few. Their fame and fortune are alike. But the actions of those who hold great power and pass their lives in a lofty station are known to all the world. Thus for those in the highest position there is the least room for error. In that position neither partiality nor dislike is proper, and anger least of all. For what in others is called irascibility, this in a ruler is termed hubris and cruelty. For my own part, fathers of the Senate, I consider no torture sufficient for the crimes of these men. But most mortals remember only that which happens last. And even in the case of godless men, they forget their guilt and discourse upon the punishment they have received, if it is but a little more severe than normal. I have no doubt that Decimus Silanus, a gallant and brave man, was led by patriotism to say what he did say, and that in a matter of such moment he showed neither favor nor enmity. So well do I know the man's character and moderation. Yet his proposal seems to me, I will not say cruel, for what could be cruel in the case of such men, but foreign to the customs of our country. For surely, Silanus, it was either fear or the gravity of the offense which impelled you, a consul-elect, to favor a novel form of punishment. As regards fear, it is needless to speak, especially since, thanks to the precautions of our distinguished consul, we have such strong guards under arms. So far as the penalty is concerned, I can say with truth that amid grief and wretchedness, death is a relief from woes, not a punishment. That it puts an end to all mortal ills and leaves no room either for sorrow or for joy. But in the name of heaven, why did you not, Silanus, add the recommendation that they first be scourged? Was it because the Porcian law forbids? Yes, but there are other laws which provide that Roman citizens, even when found guilty, shall not lose their lives, but shall be permitted to go into exile. Was it because it is more grievous to be scourged than to be killed? But what punishment is rigorous or too grievous for men convicted of so great a crime? If, however, it was because scourging is the lighter punishment, what consistency is there in respecting the law in the lesser point when you have disregarded it in the greater? But, you may say, who will complain of a decree which is passed against traitors to their country? Time, I answer, the lapse of years, and fortune, whose caprice rules the nations. Whatever befalls these prisoners will be well deserved, but you, fathers of the Senate, are called upon to consider how your action will affect other criminals. All bad precedents have originated in cases which were good, but when the control of the government falls into the hands of men who are incompetent or bad, your new precedent is transferred from those who well deserve and merit such punishment to the undeserving and the blameless. The Lacedaemonians, after they had conquered the Athenians, set over them 30 men to carry on their government. These men began at first by putting to death without a trial the most wicked and generally hated citizens, whereat the people rejoiced greatly and declared that it was well done. But afterwards their license gradually increased, and the tyrants slew good and bad alike at pleasure and intimidated the rest. Thus the nation was reduced to slavery and had to pay a heavy penalty for its foolish rejoicing. Within our own memory, when the conqueror Sulla ordered the execution of Damasippus and others of that kind, who had become prominent at the expense of the state, who did not commend this action. All declared that those criminal intriguers who had vexed the country with their civil strife deserved their fate. But that was the beginning of great bloodshed. For whenever anyone coveted a man's house in town or country, he contrived to have that man enrolled among the proscribed. Thus those who had exulted in the death of Damasippus were themselves before long hurried off to execution, and the massacre did not end until Sulla glutted all his followers with riches. For my own part, I fear nothing of that kind for Marcus Tullius, or for our times, but in a great commonwealth there are many different natures. It is possible that at another time, when someone else is consul and is likewise in command of an army, some falsehood may be believed to be true. When the consul, with this precedent before him, shall draw the sword in obedience to the Senate's decree, who shall limit or restrain him? Our ancestors, fathers of the Senate, were never lacking either in wisdom or courage, and yet pride did not keep them from adopting foreign institutions, provided they were honorable. They took their offensive and defensive weapons from the Samnites, the badges of their magistrates for the most part from the Etruscans. In sum, whatever they found suitable among allies or foes, they put in practice at home with the greatest enthusiasm, preferring to imitate rather than envy the successful. But in that same age, following the usage of Greece, they applied the scourge to citizens and inflicted the supreme penalty upon those found guilty. Afterwards, when the state reached maturity, and because of its large population factions prevailed, when the blameless began to be oppressed and other wrongs of that kind were perpetrated, then they devised the portion law and other laws, which allowed the condemned the alternative of exile. This seems to me, Fathers of the Senate, a particularly cogent reason why we should not adopt a new policy. Surely there was greater merit and wisdom in those men who from slight resources created this mighty empire than in us who can barely hold what they gloriously won. Do I then recommend that the prisoners be allowed to depart and swell Catiline's force? By no means. This, rather, is my advice, that their goods be confiscated and that they themselves be kept imprisoned in the strongest of the free towns. Further, that no one hereafter shall refer their case to the Senate or bring it before the people, under pain of being considered by the Senate to have designs against the welfare of the state and the common safety. So there's the speech. It's a masterful composition of arguments from historical precedent, from storytelling, and many appeals to emotion disguised as appeals to reason. But for the full lesson of its significance, you have to understand what happens next. So when Caesar is done speaking, a read of the room would tell you that he had carried his case, that most of the Senate now were thinking, let's not execute these men. Even one of the consuls-elect, Decimus Silanus, says, when I said that these men should be given the extreme penalty, the most extreme penalty under law, I didn't mean execution. I meant what Caesar proposed, because that's worse than death. I mean, they're really crumpling. And so Caesar has won his case to all appearances. Cicero is facing the inevitable. He kind of wanted to execute these men, but he definitely doesn't want to do it without the Senate's backing. But the one man stands up who is absolutely not okay with this, and that is Cato. Cato the Younger stands up and he makes the opposite case. He says the Senate are being too soft. They're going back on their classic Roman virtue of vigilance. We'll do another video on that. Maybe you could check out our series that we've already done on Catiline on this channel, or the series that we've just started releasing on Cato the Younger. Apple Podcasts and Spotify are a good way to find that. But essentially, Cato sways the room in the other direction. And by the end of the day, they vote to execute the men. And that very night, the conspirators, Lentulus, Cethegus, and the others, they're all executed in the Mamertine prison. And here's the important outcome of this event for Caesar. Because Caesar sensed that even though the Senate was mostly against these men, there were large swaths of the population that really admired Catiline and the conspirators because they were trying to change up the system. What they were representing was things like cancellation of debts, redistribution of land, fighting against wealth inequality. These people, the masses of Rome, wanted to see things shaken up, and Caesar sensed that. And so by defending men who the Senate all agreed were accursed, but the people sort of had a soft spot for, Caesar took up that mantle of populism. He was a representative of people who didn't get a fair shake, who wanted to see things change for the better, perhaps. Maybe see things change for the better at the expense of the elites, the toffs, the blue bloods. And thus, even though he lost his case, he won from it politically by becoming the person, as Catiline was soon defeated in battle and the conspirators were executed that night, he became the representative of all those concerns that the people had that had fueled the Catilinarian conspiracy. And the very next year, he's the praetor, and alongside another populist, Metellus Nepos, they're proposing land bills, they're trying to get populist policies pushed through. And because Caesar has such power among the people, the Senate just can't challenge him as effectively as it can many other populist politicians, because his support is really genuine. So that's Caesar, I think, taking a play from Cato's usual playbook, which is to win by spectacular defeats that sort of end up in a moral victory. Well, Caesar kind of got a moral victory from this in the eyes of the people. So think about this speech the next time you have to make a tough case. Tactical empathy, the importance of framing the audience in a certain way, the power of storytelling and precedence. Think also about, is there a way that if you lose, you can do so with dignity, representing a cause or a constituency that sets you up for a bigger win the next time you face a similar arena. For more lessons like this, check out my channel, Cost of Glory. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you soon.